Question 1. Quality control measures reveal that a juvenile court judge in Alabama is presiding over a disposition hearing for a 15-year-old adjudicated delinquent for a misdemeanor offense involving property damage. The predispositional report indicates the child has a history of truancy and exhibits signs of behavioral issues stemming from family instability. The judge is considering several potential outcomes. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles and statutory framework of Alabama juvenile law for disposition hearings and sentencing options? Option A. Imposing a period of detention in a county jail for 30 days to serve as a deterrent and teach the juvenile a lesson about the consequences of their actions. Option B. Mandating that the juvenile's parents pay a significant fine to the court and attend parenting classes without directly involving the juvenile in any rehabilitative services. Option C. Releasing the juvenile with a stern warning and no further supervision or requirements, given the offense was a misdemeanor. Option D. Ordering the juvenile to participate in a community-based rehabilitation program that includes mandatory counseling for behavioral issues, regular school attendance monitoring, and restitution for the property damage, with a review hearing scheduled in 6 months. The correct answer is D. Ordering the juvenile to participate in a community-based rehabilitation program that includes mandatory counseling for behavioral issues, regular school attendance monitoring, and restitution for the property damage, with a review hearing scheduled in 6 months. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the juvenile court judge in Alabama must balance the rehabilitative goals of juvenile justice with public safety concerns, while adhering strictly to the dispositional options permitted under Alabama juvenile law. The judge's decision requires a nuanced understanding of the child's needs, the nature of the offense, and the available resources, all within the statutory framework. Careful judgment is required to select a disposition that is both effective for the child's rehabilitation and appropriate for the offense. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment of the child's circumstances and needs, followed by the selection of a disposition that is specifically authorized by Alabama law and tailored to promote the child's rehabilitation and address the underlying causes of their behavior. This approach prioritizes the best interests of the child while also considering public safety. Alabama Code Section 12-15-301 and Section 12-15-302 outline the permissible dispositional alternatives, emphasizing rehabilitation and treatment. A disposition that aligns with these statutory goals, such as a structured probation with mandatory counseling and educational support, is the most appropriate. An incorrect approach would be to impose a disposition that exceeds the court's statutory authority or is not supported by evidence presented during the dispositional hearing. For instance, ordering a juvenile to a correctional facility not designated for juveniles under Alabama law, or imposing a sanction that is punitive rather than rehabilitative without a clear statutory basis, would be a failure to comply with the law. Similarly, a disposition that does not consider the child's individual needs and instead relies on a blanket, one-size-fits-all approach would be professionally unacceptable, as it fails to uphold the rehabilitative principles of juvenile justice. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard the recommendations of the probation department or treatment providers without a compelling legal justification, as these recommendations are crucial for informed decision-making under Alabama juvenile law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough review of the case facts, the findings of the adjudicatory hearing, and any predispositional reports. This should be followed by a careful examination of the dispositional options available under Alabama Code Title 12, Chapter 15. The judge must then consider the child's amenability to treatment, the risk of reoffending, and the need for public protection. The chosen disposition must be the least restrictive alternative that effectively addresses the child's needs and promotes rehabilitation, while remaining within the bounds of statutory authority. Question 2. Strategic planning requires Alabama juvenile justice professionals to consider various approaches when addressing a juvenile offender's case. Given the principles of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act and Alabama's Juvenile Code, which of the following represents the most effective and legally compliant strategy for managing such cases? Option A. Rely on standardized, one-size-fits-all programs that do not account for the unique characteristics or specific challenges faced by individual juvenile offenders. Option B. Implement interventions based solely on the severity of the offense, without a thorough evaluation of the juvenile's individual needs or the availability of community-based resources. Option C. Emphasize punitive measures and secure confinement as the primary response to ensure accountability and deter future offenses, regardless of rehabilitative potential. Option D. Prioritize a comprehensive assessment of the juvenile's needs and circumstances, focusing on diversionary programs and rehabilitative interventions that align with state and federal legislative intent. Correct answer is D. Prioritize a comprehensive assessment of the juvenile's needs and circumstances, focusing on diversionary programs and rehabilitative interventions that align with state and federal legislative intent. Explanation. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of the legal landscape governing juvenile justice in Alabama. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs of a juvenile offender with the long-term goals of rehabilitation and public safety, all while adhering strictly to Alabama's specific juvenile laws and the Federal Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, JJDPA. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting and applying these legal frameworks to a complex factual situation, ensuring that the juvenile's rights are protected and that the chosen course of action aligns with legislative intent. The best professional approach involves a comprehensive assessment of the juvenile's circumstances, including the nature of the offense, their individual needs, and available community resources, with a primary focus on diversionary programs and rehabilitative interventions as prioritized by the JJDPA and Alabama's Juvenile Code. This approach recognizes that the JJDPA, while federal, mandates certain standards and encourages states to adopt practices that emphasize community-based programs and deinstitutionalization of non-offenders. Alabama's Juvenile Code, in turn, provides the specific statutory framework for implementing these principles, including provisions for intake, detention, adjudication, and disposition. Prioritizing diversionary options and rehabilitation aligns with the legislative intent to treat juveniles differently from adults, focusing on their development and potential for positive change, thereby reducing recidivism and promoting successful reintegration into society. An approach that solely focuses on punitive measures without exploring rehabilitative or diversionary options fails to acknowledge the core tenets of juvenile justice, which are rooted in rehabilitation rather than retribution. This would be a regulatory failure, as it neglects the spirit and explicit provisions of the JJDPA and Alabama's Juvenile Code that advocate for less restrictive alternatives. Similarly, an approach that disregards the specific requirements of Alabama's Juvenile Code regarding due process and the rights of the juvenile, such as the right to legal counsel or the prohibition of certain detention practices, would be a significant legal and ethical failure. Furthermore, an approach that relies on outdated or unproven interventions without considering evidence-based practices or the availability of specialized services for the juvenile's specific needs would be professionally deficient and potentially harmful, failing to meet the standard of care expected in juvenile justice. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough review of the relevant statutes, including the JJDPA and Alabama's Juvenile Code. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of the individual juvenile, considering their background, offense, and needs. The decision-making process should then involve exploring all available dispositional options, prioritizing those that are rehabilitative and community-based in accordance with legislative intent. Consultation with legal counsel, probation officers, and other relevant professionals is crucial to ensure that the chosen path is both legally sound and in the best interest of the juvenile and the community. Question 3. In Alabama, when representing a minor accused of an offense, which approach best reflects the fundamental differences between the juvenile and adult justice systems? Option A. Prioritizing public opinion and the perceived need for punitive measures to deter future offenses, regardless of the juvenile's individual circumstances. Option B. Treating the case as a standard criminal matter, focusing primarily on establishing guilt and applying the most severe legally permissible sanctions. Option C. Advocating for dispositions and interventions that align with the rehabilitative goals and best interests of the child, as outlined in the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act. Option D. seeking to impose penalties and consequences that are commensurate with those typically received by adult offenders for similar offenses. The correct answer is C. Advocating for dispositions and interventions that align with the rehabilitative goals and best interests of the child as outlined in the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a nuanced understanding of the fundamental philosophical differences between the juvenile and adult justice systems in Alabama. A juvenile court's primary focus is rehabilitation and the best interests of the child, while the adult system emphasizes punishment and public safety. Misinterpreting these core distinctions can lead to inappropriate legal strategies and outcomes that fail to serve the child or the community effectively. The best professional approach involves recognizing and leveraging the distinct legal frameworks and rehabilitative goals inherent in Alabama's juvenile justice system. This means advocating for interventions and dispositions that align with the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act, such as probation, counseling, or educational programs, tailored to the individual needs of the juvenile. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the statutory mandate of the juvenile court, which prioritizes the child's welfare and potential for rehabilitation over punitive measures typically applied in adult criminal proceedings. The Alabama Code, particularly Title 12, Chapter 15, outlines the parens patriae doctrine and the focus on the best interests of the child, guiding all juvenile court actions towards rehabilitation and reintegration. An approach that focuses solely on the severity of the offense and seeks to impose penalties equivalent to those in adult court fails to acknowledge the rehabilitative purpose of the juvenile system. This is a regulatory failure because it disregards the specific legislative intent behind Alabama's juvenile justice laws, which are designed to treat young offenders differently due to their developmental stage and capacity for change. Another incorrect approach would be to treat the juvenile as an adult offender without exploring all available juvenile court options. This is ethically problematic as it abandons the protective and rehabilitative mandate of the juvenile court, potentially leading to outcomes that are detrimental to the child's long-term development and societal reintegration. It ignores the legal protections and specialized procedures afforded to juveniles under Alabama law. Finally, an approach that prioritizes public perception or the perceived need for harsh punishment over the child's individual circumstances and potential for rehabilitation is also professionally unsound. This deviates from the core principles of juvenile justice, which are rooted in the belief that young people can be guided towards positive change. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act and its underlying principles. This involves assessing the juvenile's background, needs, and the specific circumstances of the offense, and then formulating a strategy that aligns with the rehabilitative goals of the juvenile court, always prioritizing the child's best interests within the legal framework. Question 4. Investigation of a 14-year-old's alleged shoplifting of a small item in Montgomery, Alabama, has been completed by the intake officer. The juvenile has no prior offenses and comes from a stable home environment. The officer is considering the next steps in the intake process. Which of the following approaches best aligns with Alabama's juvenile justice principles and best practices for intake? Option A. Assess the juvenile's eligibility for and suitability for a diversion program, such as a restorative justice circle or community service, given the minor nature of the offense and the juvenile's clean record. Option B. Offer the juvenile a diversion program without a thorough assessment of the offense's impact or the juvenile's specific needs. Option C. Immediately file a petition with the juvenile court to initiate formal proceedings for adjudication and disposition. Option D. Focus solely on recommending a formal reprimand from the court, without exploring any rehabilitative or diversionary options. Correct answer is A. Assess the juvenile's eligibility for and suitability for a diversion program, such as a restorative justice circle or community service, given the minor nature of the offense and the juvenile's clean record. Explanation: investigation of a juvenile's alleged offense in Alabama presents a professionally challenging scenario due to the paramount importance of balancing accountability with the rehabilitative goals inherent in juvenile justice. The intake process, governed by Alabama's Juvenile Code and departmental policies, requires careful judgment to determine the most appropriate path forward, considering the child's best interests, public safety, and the potential for diversion. The challenge lies in accurately assessing the severity of the offense, the juvenile's background, and the availability of community-based resources to avoid unnecessary formal court involvement while still ensuring accountability. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment of the juvenile and the alleged offense to determine eligibility for and suitability of diversion programs. This approach prioritizes early intervention and aims to address the underlying causes of delinquent behavior through non-judicial means, such as counseling, community service, or educational programs. Alabama law and policy encourage diversion when appropriate, recognizing its effectiveness in reducing recidivism and promoting positive youth development. This aligns with the ethical imperative to treat juveniles differently from adults and to focus on rehabilitation, an approach that immediately refers all cases to formal court proceedings without a thorough intake assessment for diversion eligibility fails to uphold the principles of juvenile justice. This bypasses a crucial step designed to offer alternatives to adjudication and disposition, potentially leading to unnecessary stigmatization and involvement in the formal justice system for minor offenses or first-time offenders. It neglects the statutory encouragement of diversion and the potential benefits it offers to the juvenile and the community. Another unacceptable approach is to automatically offer diversion for all offenses, regardless of severity or the juvenile's history. This undermines the seriousness of certain offenses and may not provide adequate accountability or public safety assurances. It also fails to consider situations where formal court intervention might be necessary for more serious offenses or for juveniles who have not benefited from previous diversion attempts. This approach risks trivializing the justice process and failing to meet the needs of victims or the community. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on punitive measures during intake, without exploring rehabilitative or restorative options, is professionally unsound. The Alabama juvenile justice system is fundamentally geared towards rehabilitation. Ignoring diversion and focusing only on formal sanctions misses the opportunity to address the root causes of delinquency and to guide the juvenile toward a more positive future. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough intake investigation, gathering information about the offense, the juvenile's background, family circumstances, and any prior involvement with the justice system. This information should then be used to evaluate the juvenile's suitability for available diversion programs, considering the offense's nature and severity, and the potential for positive outcomes. If diversion is deemed appropriate, it should be implemented with clear expectations and monitoring. If diversion is not suitable, the case should proceed to formal court processes with a clear understanding of the reasons for this decision. Question 5. Considering the historical trajectory of juvenile justice in Alabama, which of the following best characterizes the fundamental shift in philosophy that has shaped its development over time? Option A. A transition from a punitive, adult-centric model to a rehabilitative, child-focused approach guided by the principle of parens patriae. Option B. An exclusive focus on the procedural intricacies of juvenile court proceedings without regard for underlying social reforms. Option C. A static legal framework for juvenile offenders that has remained unchanged since the establishment of early courts. Option D. A consistent application of adult criminal statutes to minors throughout Alabama's legal history. Correct answer is A. A transition from a punitive, adult-centric model to a rehabilitative, child-focused approach guided by the principle of parens patriae. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in understanding the foundational principles that shaped Alabama's juvenile justice system. The historical development of juvenile law is not merely an academic exercise. It directly informs the philosophical underpinnings and statutory frameworks that govern how the state treats its young offenders. A failure to grasp this history can lead to misinterpretations of current laws, an inability to advocate effectively for juveniles, and a misunderstanding of the evolution of concepts like parens patriae and rehabilitation versus punishment. Careful judgment is required to identify the approach that most accurately reflects the historical trajectory and intent behind Alabama's juvenile justice reforms. Correct approach analysis. The approach that best reflects the historical development of juvenile law in Alabama emphasizes the shift from a punitive, adult-like system to one focused on rehabilitation and the best interests of the child. This historical trajectory, particularly evident in the early 20th century, saw the establishment of separate juvenile courts and a recognition of the unique needs and vulnerabilities of minors. The underlying philosophy was rooted in the concept of parens patriae, where the state acted as a benevolent guardian, aiming to correct and guide rather than simply punish. This approach acknowledges the evolution from earlier, harsher methods to a more individualized and rehabilitative model, aligning with the foundational principles that continue to influence Alabama's juvenile justice statutes. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that solely focuses on the punitive aspects of early legal responses to juvenile delinquency, without acknowledging the subsequent development of rehabilitative philosophies, fails to capture the historical evolution. This perspective overlooks the significant reforms that established separate juvenile courts and introduced concepts like the best interest of the child, which were a direct departure from treating juveniles as miniature adults subject to the same criminal penalties. Another incorrect approach would be to solely emphasize the legalistic and procedural aspects of juvenile proceedings, without considering the underlying social and philosophical shifts that drove these changes. While procedures are important, the historical development is fundamentally about the changing societal views on childhood, delinquency, and the role of the state in addressing these issues. Finally, an approach that suggests juvenile law has remained static and unchanged since its inception in Alabama would be historically inaccurate. The field has undergone significant transformations, influenced by societal changes, legal scholarship, and landmark court decisions, all of which have shaped its current form. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama's juvenile justice system should approach the historical development of juvenile law by understanding it as a narrative of evolving societal values and legal philosophies. This involves recognizing the transition from punitive measures to rehabilitative ideals, the establishment of distinct juvenile courts, and the enduring principle of parens patriae. This historical context provides a crucial lens through which to interpret current statutes, advocate for appropriate interventions, and understand the rationale behind the system's structure and goals. When faced with a question about historical development, professionals should look for the option that best encapsulates this progressive shift towards child welfare and rehabilitation, rather than focusing on isolated punitive elements or ignoring the dynamic nature of legal reform. Question 6. System analysis indicates that a juvenile probation officer in Mobile County, Alabama, is preparing a dispositional recommendation for a 15-year-old male adjudicated delinquent for a property offense. The officer has gathered information on the youth's family background, school performance, and a recent psychological evaluation. Considering the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code, which of the following approaches best guides the officer's recommendation for disposition? Option A. Suggesting a disposition that focuses only on imposing fines and community service hours, without considering the psychological evaluation or the potential need for rehabilitative services. Option B. Recommending a disposition that includes a structured probation plan with mandated counseling and restitution, tailored to the youth's identified needs and within the statutory dispositional alternatives available under Alabama Code Title 12, Chapter 15. Option C. Recommending incarceration in a state juvenile correctional facility solely because the offense involved property damage, regardless of the youth's rehabilitative needs or the availability of less restrictive options. Option D. Proposing a disposition that requires the youth to attend a private, out-of-state therapeutic boarding school without first verifying if such a placement is statutorily permissible or cost-effective under Alabama law. The correct answer is B. Recommending a disposition that includes a structured probation plan with mandated counseling and restitution, tailored to the youth's identified needs and within the statutory dispositional alternatives available under Alabama Code Title 12, Chapter 15. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a juvenile probation officer in Alabama to navigate the complexities of the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code, specifically concerning the dispositional alternatives available for a delinquent youth. The officer must balance the best interests of the child with public safety and the rehabilitative goals of the juvenile justice system, all while adhering strictly to statutory limitations and guidelines. Misinterpreting or misapplying these statutes can lead to inappropriate dispositions, potentially harming the youth's future prospects, or failing to address the underlying issues contributing to delinquency. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment of the youth's needs, the nature of the offense, and the available statutory dispositional options under the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. This approach prioritizes gathering all relevant information, including social history, psychological evaluations, and educational records, to inform a recommendation that aligns with the Alabama Code's provisions for rehabilitation and public safety. Specifically, the officer must consider dispositional alternatives outlined in Alabama Code Title 12, Chapter 15, such as probation with specific conditions, community-based programs, or, in more severe cases, placement in a juvenile detention facility or residential treatment center, always ensuring the chosen disposition is the least restrictive effective measure. This aligns with the statutory mandate to serve the best interests of the child and the public. Incorrect approaches analysis. Recommending a disposition solely based on the severity of the offense without a thorough needs assessment fails to adhere to the rehabilitative principles embedded in the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. Code emphasizes individualized treatment plans, not just punitive measures. Proposing a disposition that exceeds the statutory authority of the juvenile court or probation department, such as mandating a specific sentence length not permitted by Alabama law for the offense, is a direct violation of the code and undermines the legal framework. Focusing exclusively on punitive measures without considering rehabilitative services, such as counseling or educational support, neglects the statutory directive to address the underlying causes of delinquency and promote the youth's successful reintegration into society. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a systematic decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant state statutes. In this case, the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. This involves identifying the specific legal framework governing the youth's situation, conducting a comprehensive risk and needs assessment, and then evaluating potential dispositional options against the statutory requirements and the youth's individual circumstances. Consultation with supervisors and legal counsel is advisable when navigating complex or ambiguous statutory interpretations. Question 7. The monitoring system demonstrates a need to assess the current juvenile justice practices in Alabama against international benchmarks. Considering Alabama's adherence to international standards and treaties related to juvenile justice, which of the following approaches best reflects a commitment to upholding the rights and welfare of juveniles within the state's legal framework? Option A. Focus exclusively on the punitive aspects of juvenile justice as mandated by Alabama law, without incorporating international perspectives on rehabilitation and diversion. Option B. Disregard international standards as they do not directly supersede Alabama's established juvenile justice statutes and regulations. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of applicable international treaties and conventions, identifying principles that can be integrated into Alabama's juvenile justice policies and procedures to enhance child protection and rehabilitation. Option D. Implement international standards only when they align with existing Alabama laws, ignoring those that might require significant procedural or substantive changes. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive review of applicable international treaties and conventions, identifying principles that can be integrated into Alabama's juvenile justice policies and procedures to enhance child protection and rehabilitation. Explanation. The monitoring system demonstrates a critical need for careful judgment due to the inherent complexities of international juvenile justice standards and their application within Alabama's specific legal framework. The challenge lies in balancing the state's sovereign authority and existing statutes with the aspirational goals and binding obligations potentially imposed by international instruments. Professionals must navigate potential conflicts, ensure compliance, and advocate for the best interests of the child, which may require interpreting and applying principles that are not explicitly codified in state law. The most appropriate approach involves a thorough review and integration of relevant international standards and treaties into the existing juvenile justice protocols in Alabama. This entails identifying which international instruments, such as the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child (UNCRC), or relevant ILO conventions, Alabama is bound by or chooses to consider as best practice. The process requires understanding how these international principles, like the best interests of the child, the right to be heard, and diversion from the justice system, can be practically implemented within the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. This approach is correct because it prioritizes a proactive and compliant stance, ensuring that Alabama's juvenile justice system aligns with globally recognized human rights principles for children, thereby enhancing the protection and rehabilitation of young offenders. It acknowledges that international standards can inform and improve domestic law and practice, even if not directly enforceable without legislative incorporation. An approach that dismisses international standards as irrelevant to Alabama's juvenile justice system is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of awareness or a deliberate disregard for potential international obligations or best practices that could significantly benefit the welfare of children in the justice system. It risks violating principles of international human rights law and could lead to practices that are out of step with global norms, potentially exposing the state to criticism and hindering efforts to provide the most effective rehabilitation and protection for juveniles. Another professionally unsound approach is to selectively apply international standards only when they conveniently align with existing Alabama statutes, while ignoring those that might necessitate changes or greater protections. This selective application undermines the holistic intent of international treaties and conventions, which are designed to establish a comprehensive framework for juvenile justice. It represents a superficial engagement with international law, failing to uphold the spirit of these agreements and potentially leaving gaps in the protection afforded to vulnerable youth. Finally, an approach that prioritizes solely the punitive aspects of juvenile justice, without considering the rehabilitative and restorative principles often emphasized in international standards, is also flawed. International instruments generally advocate for a justice system that focuses on the child's development, reintegration into society, and minimizing the negative impacts of formal justice proceedings. An exclusive focus on punishment, divorced from these international best practices, can be detrimental to a child's long-term prospects and contravenes the underlying philosophy of juvenile justice as understood in many international frameworks. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of Alabama's current juvenile justice laws. This should be followed by a diligent research into applicable international standards and treaties, assessing their relevance and potential impact. A critical analysis of how these international principles can be integrated or used to inform policy and practice, while respecting state sovereignty, is essential. This process requires ongoing professional development and a commitment to child-centered justice. Question 8. Strategic planning requires a juvenile justice professional in Alabama to consider how to best protect a minor's constitutional rights when they are taken into custody and questioned about a serious offense. Which of the following actions demonstrates the most appropriate and constitutionally sound approach? Option A. Conduct a thorough interrogation of the juvenile, believing that their age and perceived understanding of the situation negate the need for immediate legal representation. Option B. Rely on the juvenile's parent or guardian to explain their constitutional rights and obtain a waiver of those rights without the juvenile having direct access to legal counsel. Option C. Immediately cease all questioning and ensure the juvenile is provided with an attorney before any further interrogation, especially if the juvenile expresses confusion or requests to speak with a parent. Option D. Proceed with questioning the juvenile after informing them of their rights, but delay securing legal counsel until after the initial statement is obtained, assuming parental consent is given. The correct answer is C. Immediately cease all questioning and ensure the juvenile is provided with an attorney before any further interrogation, especially if the juvenile expresses confusion or requests to speak with a parent. Explanation. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of constitutional rights to ensure due process for all individuals, especially juveniles who are in a vulnerable stage of development and may not fully comprehend their legal standing. In Alabama, the juvenile justice system is designed to balance accountability with rehabilitation, and adherence to constitutional protections is paramount. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a juvenile facing potential adjudication for a serious offense. The core challenge lies in balancing the need for effective investigation and prosecution with the absolute requirement to uphold the juvenile's constitutional rights, particularly the right to counsel and the right against self-incrimination. Missteps in this area can lead to the suppression of evidence, dismissal of charges, and damage to the integrity of the juvenile justice system in Alabama. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves ensuring that the juvenile's constitutional rights are scrupulously protected from the outset of any interaction with law enforcement or the court system. This means that immediately upon apprehension or when questioning becomes custodial, the juvenile must be informed of their right to remain silent and their right to have an attorney present. If the juvenile indicates a desire to remain silent or requests an attorney, all questioning must cease until counsel is present. This approach aligns directly with the protections afforded by the 5th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, as interpreted by landmark Supreme Court cases like Miranda v. Arizona and its application to juveniles, and further reinforced by Alabama's own juvenile justice statutes and rules of procedure, which emphasize the importance of legal representation and voluntariness of statements. The Alabama Rules of Juvenile Procedure, for instance, mandate advisement of rights and the presence of counsel in critical stages. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to proceed with questioning the juvenile after they have expressed confusion or a desire to speak with a parent, without first ensuring legal counsel has been secured or the juvenile has knowingly and voluntarily waived their right to counsel. This violates the juvenile's right to counsel and potentially their right against self-incrimination, as any statements made under such circumstances could be deemed involuntary and inadmissible. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on parental consent to waive the juvenile's rights, without the juvenile themselves understanding and agreeing to the waiver, and without ensuring the parent fully grasps the implications of the waiver. While parental presence is important, it does not negate the juvenile's individual constitutional rights. Furthermore, assuming a juvenile is mature enough to understand their rights without explicit, clear advisement and the opportunity to consult with an attorney is a critical ethical and legal failure. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama's juvenile justice system must adopt a proactive and protective stance regarding a juvenile's constitutional rights. Decision-making process should begin with the presumption that a juvenile is entitled to the full spectrum of constitutional protections. This involves a clear, step-by-step protocol for advising juveniles of their rights, ensuring the presence of legal counsel at critical junctures, and meticulously documenting all interactions to demonstrate compliance. When in doubt, the professional should err on the side of caution and ensure the juvenile's rights are fully safeguarded, even if it means delaying an investigation or questioning. Question 9. Strategic planning requires a juvenile probation officer in Alabama to determine the most appropriate level of supervision and placement for a recently adjudicated delinquent youth. The officer has completed a standardized risk assessment, which indicates a moderate risk of recidivism. Considering the nuances of juvenile court procedures in Alabama, which of the following approaches best guides the officer's recommendation for supervision and placement? Option A. Prioritize recommendations based on the immediate availability of bed space in local detention facilities or community-based programs, regardless of the detailed risk assessment findings. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the risk assessment results, integrating them with direct observations of the youth's behavior, interviews with the youth and their family, and consultation with other professionals involved in the youth's life to formulate a recommendation for the least restrictive, yet effective, intervention. Option C. Solely base the recommendation on the numerical score generated by the risk assessment tool, classifying the youth as moderate risk and recommending standard probation without further investigation. Option D. Defer the final decision regarding supervision and placement entirely to the youth's parents or guardians, accepting their judgment as the primary determinant. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of the risk assessment results, integrating them with direct observations of the youth's behavior, interviews with the youth and their family, and consultation with other professionals involved in the youth's life to formulate a recommendation for the least restrictive, yet effective, intervention. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires a juvenile probation officer in Alabama to balance the immediate need for intervention with the child's right to due process and the potential for rehabilitation. The officer must make a critical decision regarding the child's placement and supervision level based on a risk assessment, which can have significant long-term consequences for the child and the community. The challenge lies in accurately interpreting the risk assessment tool, considering all relevant factors, and ensuring the chosen approach aligns with Alabama's juvenile justice principles and statutory requirements. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive review of the risk assessment, coupled with direct observation and consultation with relevant parties. This approach acknowledges that a risk assessment tool is a guide, not a definitive determinant. It requires the probation officer to synthesize the quantitative data from the assessment with qualitative information, such as the child's demeanor, family support system, and available community resources. This holistic evaluation ensures that the placement and supervision plan is tailored to the individual child's needs and risks, as mandated by the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act, which emphasizes individualized treatment and the least restrictive environment necessary to ensure public safety and the child's welfare. This approach prioritizes a nuanced understanding of the child's situation, aligning with the Act's focus on rehabilitation and reintegration. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on the numerical score generated by the risk assessment tool without further investigation or consideration of contextual factors. This fails to acknowledge the limitations of standardized tools and can lead to misclassification of risk, potentially resulting in overly restrictive placements or insufficient supervision, both of which are detrimental to the child's rehabilitation and public safety. This approach disregards the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act's emphasis on individualized assessment and intervention. Another incorrect approach is to make a placement decision based primarily on the availability of resources rather than the child's assessed risk and needs. While resource availability is a practical consideration, it should not override the fundamental principles of juvenile justice, which prioritize the child's best interests and public safety. Prioritizing convenience over a thorough risk-based assessment violates the spirit and letter of Alabama's juvenile laws, which aim for effective and appropriate interventions. A third incorrect approach is to defer the decision entirely to the child's parents or guardians without conducting an independent professional assessment. While parental input is valuable, the probation officer has a legal and ethical responsibility to ensure the child's safety and the community's protection. Abdicating this responsibility undermines the juvenile court's authority and the probation officer's role in making informed, legally sound recommendations. This approach neglects the statutory duties of the probation officer under Alabama law. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the specific legal framework governing their practice in Alabama. This involves thoroughly reviewing the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act and any relevant administrative rules. Next, they should utilize assessment tools as intended as aids to professional judgment, not as replacements for it. This means critically evaluating the data, considering the child's unique circumstances, and seeking corroborating information. Collaboration with other professionals, including social workers, educators, and mental health providers, is crucial. Finally, decisions must be documented meticulously, clearly articulating the rationale based on the gathered evidence and legal requirements, ensuring accountability and transparency. Question 10. Strategic planning requires a juvenile probation officer in Alabama to recommend a dispositional plan for a 15-year-old adjudicated delinquent for property offenses. The officer has identified two potential programs. Program A, costing $5,000 annually with an estimated 70% recidivism reduction rate over 5 years, and Program B, costing $3,000 annually with an estimated 40% recidivism reduction rate over 5 years. Assuming the societal cost of recidivism for this offense type is $10,000 per year per offense, and using a discount rate of 5% for future costs and benefits, which approach to calculating the net benefit of each program provides the most appropriate basis for a recommendation under Alabama Juvenile Law. Option A. Calculate the net benefit of each program by discounting future costs and benefits over a 5-year period, subtracting the present value of total costs from the present value of total benefits, societal cost savings from reduced recidivism. Option B. Focus only on the immediate annual costs of each program, assuming that the cheapest program will yield the best overall outcome for the child and the state. Option C. Prioritize program A due to its higher recidivism reduction rate, disregarding the increased annual cost and the need for a formal cost-benefit calculation. Option D. Recommend program B solely because it has a lower annual cost, without a detailed analysis of its long-term recidivism reduction effectiveness compared to program A. Correct answer is A. Calculate the net benefit of each program by discounting future costs and benefits over a 5-year period, subtracting the present value of total costs from the present value of total benefits, societal cost savings from reduced recidivism. Explanation. Strategic planning requires careful consideration of various factors when determining the appropriate course of action in the adjudication process within Alabama Juvenile Court. This scenario is professionally challenging because it necessitates balancing the child's best interests with the need for accountability and rehabilitation, all while adhering strictly to the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. The calculation of a dispositional plan's cost-effectiveness and potential recidivism reduction involves complex data interpretation and predictive modeling, demanding a nuanced understanding of both legal mandates and social science principles. The best approach involves a comprehensive cost-benefit analysis that quantifies the projected expenses of a proposed dispositional plan against its anticipated positive outcomes, such as reduced reoffending rates and improved educational attainment. This method is correct because it aligns with the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code's emphasis on dispositional orders being in the best interest of the child and the public, and that such orders should be designed to achieve rehabilitation and prevent future delinquency. Specifically, Alabama Code Section 12-15-201A mandates that dispositional orders shall be designed to protect the public, provide for the needs of the child, and hold the child accountable. A cost-benefit analysis directly addresses these by evaluating the financial implications of meeting the child's needs and the public's safety, while also projecting the long-term economic and social benefits of reduced recidivism. The formula for calculating the net benefit NB would be \NB equals \sum t equals 0 n \frac bt ct 1 plus rt \where \bt equals benefits at time \t e.g. reduced societal costs of crime, increased future earnings of the child /CT equals cost at time /T e.g. program fees, supervision costs, incarceration costs /R equals discount rate /N equals time horizon. An approach that solely focuses on minimizing immediate program costs without considering long-term recidivism reduction fails to meet the statutory requirement of promoting rehabilitation and public safety. This is ethically and legally flawed because it prioritizes short-term financial savings over the child's long-term well-being and the community's security, potentially leading to higher costs in the future due to repeat offenses. An approach that relies exclusively on anecdotal evidence of program success without quantitative data or cost analysis is also unacceptable. This method lacks the rigor required by the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code to ensure dispositional orders are evidence-based and demonstrably in the child's best interest. It risks imposing ineffective or overly burdensome interventions, failing to achieve the rehabilitative goals, and potentially misallocating scarce resources. An approach that prioritizes punitive measures over rehabilitative ones, regardless of cost-effectiveness or potential for positive change, is also incorrect. While accountability is a component, the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code emphasizes rehabilitation, purely punitive approach, without a cost-benefit analysis of its effectiveness in reducing recidivism, may not serve the best interests of the child or the public in the long run, and can be more costly due to increased likelihood of reoffending. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of all available data, including program costs, projected benefits, such as reduced recidivism rates, improved educational outcomes, and enhanced vocational skills, and the specific needs and circumstances of the child. This should be guided by the principles outlined in the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code, ensuring that dispositional plans are not only legally compliant, but also evidence-based, cost-effective, and demonstrably in the best interest of the child and the public. Question 11. Strategic planning requires a probation officer in Alabama to assess a juvenile's readiness for parole, considering the juvenile's progress, risk factors, and available community resources, which of the following approaches best guides the officer's recommendation to the court? Option A. A review of the juvenile's compliance with basic probation rules, such as attending scheduled meetings and avoiding new arrests. Option B. A recommendation based primarily on the length of time the juvenile has been on probation and the absence of new offenses. Option C. A recommendation that heavily weighs the expressed desires of the victim and the concerns of the community. Option D. A comprehensive risk assessment that integrates demonstrated progress on probation with objective risk factors and the availability of appropriate community-based rehabilitative resources. The correct answer is D. A comprehensive risk assessment that integrates demonstrated progress on probation with objective risk factors and the availability of appropriate community-based rehabilitative resources. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the rehabilitative goals of the juvenile justice system with public safety concerns, all while adhering to the specific mandates of Alabama juvenile law concerning probation and parole. The probation officer must make a recommendation that is both legally sound and ethically responsible, considering the juvenile's progress, risk factors, and the community's needs. Careful judgment is required to avoid overly lenient or overly punitive recommendations that could have detrimental long-term consequences for the youth and the public. The best approach involves a comprehensive risk assessment that integrates the juvenile's demonstrated progress on probation with objective risk factors and the availability of appropriate community-based rehabilitative resources. This approach aligns with the principles of balanced probation, which seeks to protect the community, hold the juvenile accountable, and provide services for rehabilitation. Alabama juvenile probation officers are guided by statutes and departmental policies that emphasize individualized assessment and the use of evidence-based practices to determine the most effective interventions. This method ensures that recommendations are grounded in data, the juvenile's specific circumstances, and the statutory framework for juvenile probation in Alabama, prioritizing interventions that are most likely to lead to successful reintegration and reduce recidivism. An approach that solely focuses on the juvenile's compliance with basic probation rules, without a deeper analysis of underlying behavioral patterns or risk factors, fails to adequately address the complexities of rehabilitation and public safety. This oversight can lead to recommendations that are either insufficient to prevent future delinquent behavior or unnecessarily restrictive, hindering the juvenile's progress. Recommending parole solely based on the passage of time or the absence of new offenses, without a thorough evaluation of the juvenile's rehabilitative progress and ongoing risk assessment, is also problematic. Alabama juvenile law requires a more nuanced approach that considers the juvenile's development and the effectiveness of interventions. This approach neglects the proactive element of ensuring the juvenile is truly prepared for release and less likely to reoffend. Prioritizing the wishes of the victim or the community without a balanced consideration of the juvenile's rehabilitative potential and legal rights would be an ethical and legal failure. While victim input is important, recommendations must be made within the legal framework of Alabama juvenile justice, which mandates a focus on the best interests of the child and their rehabilitation, alongside public safety. The professional reasoning process should involve a systematic review of the juvenile's case file, including progress reports, psychological evaluations, and any treatment plans. The probation officer must conduct a thorough risk assessment, utilizing validated tools where appropriate, to identify criminogenic needs and protective factors. This assessment should then inform a recommendation that is tailored to the individual juvenile, considering the availability and suitability of community-based services and supervision levels, all within the legal parameters set forth by Alabama juvenile law. Question 12. The control framework reveals that a juvenile in Alabama has been adjudicated delinquent and placed in a residential facility. The juvenile's attorney believes there are grounds for appeal regarding the adjudication. Considering the strict timelines for initiating appeals in Alabama juvenile court, which of the following actions best upholds the juvenile's right to appeal? Option A. Advise the family to focus on the juvenile's adjustment to the residential facility and to consider an appeal after the placement is completed. Option B. Assume that the juvenile's placement in a facility automatically preserves their right to appeal at any point during their time there. Option C. Rely on the juvenile's verbal statements expressing dissatisfaction with the court's decision as sufficient grounds to initiate the appeal process later. Option D. Immediately file a written notice of appeal with the juvenile court clerk within the statutory timeframe, regardless of the juvenile's current placement or the family's immediate availability. The correct answer is D. Immediately file a written notice of appeal with the juvenile court clerk within the statutory timeframe, regardless of the juvenile's current placement or the family's immediate availability. Explanation: the control framework reveals a situation requiring careful navigation of Alabama's juvenile justice system, specifically concerning the appeals process. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that a juvenile's right to appeal a delinquency adjudication is protected and exercised within the strict procedural timelines and requirements established by Alabama law, even when the juvenile's immediate circumstances might seem to overshadow this right. The urgency of the juvenile's placement and the family's emotional state can create pressure to overlook or delay critical legal steps. The best professional approach involves diligently pursuing an appeal by filing the necessary notice of appeal within the statutory timeframe, as mandated by the Alabama Rules of Juvenile Procedure. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the legal framework governing appeals in Alabama juvenile courts. Specifically, Rule 28 of the Alabama Rules of Juvenile Procedure outlines the procedure for appeals, emphasizing the strict deadline for filing the notice of appeal, which is typically within 14 days after the entry of the order or judgment being appealed. Proactively initiating this process ensures that the juvenile's legal rights are preserved and that the appellate court has jurisdiction to review the lower court's decision. This demonstrates a commitment to due process and the protection of the juvenile's rights under Alabama law. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the juvenile's placement in a residential facility negates the need for an immediate appeal or that the family can initiate the appeal at a later, more convenient time. This fails to recognize that appellate jurisdiction is time-sensitive. Alabama law does not provide for an extension of the initial filing deadline for an appeal based on the juvenile's placement or the family's convenience. Delaying the filing of the notice of appeal beyond the prescribed period would result in the appellate court losing jurisdiction, effectively waiving the juvenile's right to appeal the delinquency adjudication. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the juvenile's verbal expression of dissatisfaction with the court's decision as sufficient grounds for an appeal without taking the formal procedural steps. While verbal expressions are important indicators of a client's wishes, Alabama juvenile law requires a formal written notice of appeal to be filed with the juvenile court clerk. Failing to file this written notice means the appeal has not been properly initiated, and the appellate court will not consider the case. A further incorrect approach would be to advise the family that they can pursue an appeal after the juvenile has completed their placement. This misunderstands the purpose of an appeal, which is to seek review of the original adjudication and disposition order, not to challenge the subsequent execution of that order. The appellate court reviews the record from the original proceedings. Waiting until after placement would render the appeal moot regarding the adjudication itself and would likely be dismissed by the appellate court for lack of timeliness and relevance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the Alabama Rules of Juvenile Procedure, particularly those pertaining to appeals. Professionals must prioritize the timely filing of the notice of appeal as the critical first step. This requires proactive communication with the juvenile and their family, explaining the appellate process, its deadlines, and the importance of immediate action. It also necessitates diligent record-keeping and adherence to all procedural requirements to ensure the juvenile's rights are fully protected. Question 13. What factors determine the classification of a juvenile's alleged misconduct as a property crime, a violent crime, or a drug offense within the Alabama juvenile justice system? Option A. The juvenile's prior record and the perceived level of danger the juvenile poses to the community. Option B. A detailed examination of the specific facts and circumstances of the alleged act, compared against the statutory definitions of delinquent acts for property crimes, violent crimes, and drug offenses as defined in the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. Option C. The general age of the juvenile and whether the act involved damage to property or the possession of a controlled substance. Option D. The opinion of the arresting law enforcement officer regarding the severity of the offense. The correct answer is B. A detailed examination of the specific facts and circumstances of the alleged act, compared against the statutory definitions of delinquent acts for property crimes, violent crimes, and drug offenses as defined in the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the classification of a juvenile's offense directly impacts the legal proceedings, potential outcomes, and the rehabilitative focus of the juvenile justice system in Alabama. Misclassifying an offense can lead to inappropriate interventions, failure to address the underlying issues, and potentially violate the child's rights. Careful judgment is required to ensure the classification aligns with Alabama's Juvenile Justice Code. The best approach involves a thorough review of the specific facts and circumstances of the alleged conduct, comparing them against the definitions of property crimes, violent crimes, and drug offenses as outlined in the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. This includes examining the intent of the juvenile, the nature of the act, the presence or absence of harm or threat of harm, and the type of substance involved if it is a drug offense. This method is correct because it adheres strictly to the statutory definitions and the principles of juvenile justice in Alabama, which prioritize accurate classification for appropriate disposition. The Alabama Juvenile Justice Code, particularly its definitions of delinquent acts, provides the framework for this classification. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on the juvenile's age or a general perception of the seriousness of the act, without a detailed factual analysis. This fails to acknowledge that Alabama law defines delinquent acts based on specific elements of the offense, not just the juvenile's age or a broad societal view. Another incorrect approach would be to automatically categorize any offense involving property damage as a violent crime, or any offense involving a controlled substance as a drug offense, without considering the specific Alabama statutory definitions and nuances. For instance, a minor property damage incident might not meet the threshold for a violent crime, and the specific type of drug and quantity can influence the classification under Alabama law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive gathering of all relevant facts. This is followed by a meticulous comparison of these facts against the precise definitions of delinquent acts as defined in the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. If ambiguity exists, consulting relevant case law and seeking guidance from experienced legal professionals within the Alabama juvenile justice system is crucial. The ultimate goal is to ensure the classification is legally sound and serves the best interests of the child and public safety. Question 14. The assessment process reveals that a 14-year-old in Mobile, Alabama, has been absent from school for 15 consecutive days without a valid excuse and has also been found to be in possession of a small amount of marijuana. Based on these facts, how should the juvenile's actions be classified under Alabama juvenile law? Option A. Both the truancy and the possession of marijuana should be classified as delinquent acts. Option B. The truancy should be classified as a status offense, and the possession of marijuana should be classified as a delinquent act. Option C. The truancy should be classified as a delinquent act, and the possession of marijuana should be classified as a status offense. Option D. Both the truancy and the possession of marijuana should be classified as status offenses. The correct answer is B. The truancy should be classified as a status offense, and the possession of marijuana should be classified as a delinquent act. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a situation that is professionally challenging due to the nuanced distinction between a status offense and a delinquent act under Alabama juvenile law. Misclassifying the juvenile's behavior can lead to inappropriate intervention, potentially exacerbating the juvenile's issues or failing to address them effectively. Careful judgment is required to ensure the juvenile receives the correct legal classification and subsequent support or consequences. The best professional approach involves a thorough review of the juvenile's actions against the specific definitions provided in the Alabama Code. This means meticulously examining whether the behavior, such as truancy or running away from home, constitutes a status offense, which is an act that would not be considered a crime if committed by an adult. Alternatively, if the juvenile has engaged in conduct that is a crime for both juveniles and adults, such as theft or assault, it must be classified as a delinquent act. This precise classification is critical for determining the appropriate legal pathway, including whether the case falls under the purview of juvenile court and what dispositional options are available under Alabama law. An incorrect approach would be to broadly label any misbehavior by a juvenile as a delinquent act without considering the specific nature of the offense. This fails to recognize that Alabama law distinguishes between acts that are criminal for adults and those that are not, but are still subject to juvenile court intervention due to the juvenile's age. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss behaviors like truancy or curfew violations as minor issues that do not warrant formal intervention, even though under Alabama juvenile law, these are specifically defined as status offenses that can bring a juvenile under the court's supervision. Failing to differentiate between these categories can lead to either overcriminalization of non-criminal behavior or underintervention for behaviors that indicate a need for guidance and support. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes accurate legal classification. This involves 1. Understanding the specific definitions of status offenses and delinquent acts as outlined in the Alabama Code. 2. Gathering all relevant facts about the juvenile's alleged conduct. 3. Applying these facts to the legal definitions with precision. 4. Consulting relevant case law or legal guidance if ambiguity exists. 5. Ensuring that the classification aligns with the juvenile's best interests and the principles of juvenile justice in Alabama. Question 15. The audit findings indicate a pattern of inconsistent adherence to record-keeping protocols within the Alabama juvenile justice system. A juvenile probation officer receives a request for a juvenile's case file from a school principal who states the information is needed to address behavioral issues. The probation officer is unsure of the exact protocol, but is aware the principal is concerned about the child's welfare. What is the most appropriate course of action for the probation officer to ensure compliance with Alabama juvenile law regarding confidentiality and record-keeping? Option A. Provide the principal with a summary of the juvenile's behavioral history from the file, as the principal is a concerned party involved in the child's education and welfare. Option B. Contact the juvenile's parents and ask for their permission to share the file with the principal, as parental consent is generally sufficient for information sharing. Option C. Politely decline the request and inform the principal that access to juvenile records is strictly governed by Alabama law and requires specific legal authorization or a statutory basis, advising them to seek such authorization if deemed necessary. Option D. Release the entire juvenile case file to the principal, assuming that any individual involved in a child's well-being has an implied right to access such information. The correct answer is C. Politely decline the request and inform the principal that access to juvenile records is strictly governed by Alabama law and requires specific legal authorization or a statutory basis, advising them to seek such authorization if deemed necessary. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the need for effective juvenile justice system functioning and the paramount importance of protecting the confidentiality of juvenile records in Alabama. Mismanagement of these records can lead to serious legal repercussions, erosion of public trust, and harm to the juveniles involved. The specific challenge lies in balancing the legitimate needs of authorized individuals with the strict limitations imposed by Alabama law on access and dissemination. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a meticulous adherence to Alabama's juvenile code regarding the confidentiality and expungement of juvenile records. This approach prioritizes obtaining explicit legal authorization or demonstrating a statutory basis for any request to access or disclose juvenile records. It requires a thorough understanding of who is legally permitted to access these records, under what circumstances, and for what specific purposes. This includes verifying the identity and authority of the requesting party and documenting all disclosures meticulously. This aligns with Alabama Code Section 12-15-101 et seq., which establishes strict rules for the confidentiality of juvenile court records and outlines the limited circumstances under which they may be disclosed. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves disclosing juvenile records based on a verbal request from a law enforcement officer without verifying their specific statutory authority or the purpose of the request. This fails to meet the stringent requirements for disclosure under Alabama law, which often necessitates a court order or a clear statutory exception. The failure to verify authority and purpose creates an unauthorized disclosure, violating the confidentiality provisions. Another incorrect approach is to assume that all individuals involved in a juvenile's life, such as school counselors or social workers, have automatic access to juvenile court records. While these professionals may have legitimate interests in a juvenile's well-being, Alabama law strictly defines who can access these records. Access is not presumed and requires specific authorization or a demonstrated legal right, which is not automatically granted to all concerned parties. A third incorrect approach is to retain juvenile records indefinitely without considering the legal provisions for expungement or sealing. Alabama law provides mechanisms for the removal of juvenile records after a certain period or upon meeting specific criteria. Failing to follow these procedures and retaining records beyond their legally permissible retention period constitutes a breach of confidentiality and a failure to comply with the law's intent to allow juveniles a fresh start. Professional reasoning. Professionals in the Alabama juvenile justice system must adopt a proactive and legally informed approach to record management. This involves continuous education on the Alabama Juvenile Code's provisions concerning confidentiality, access, and expungement. When faced with a request for juvenile records, the decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the requesting party and their stated purpose. 2. Consulting the relevant sections of the Alabama Juvenile Code to determine if the request falls within a permissible disclosure category. 3. If necessary, seeking legal counsel or a court order to authorize disclosure. 4. Documenting all actions taken, including the basis for any disclosure or denial. This systematic process ensures compliance with the law and protects the rights of the juveniles involved. Question 16. Quality control measures reveal that a juvenile in Alabama has been identified by law enforcement as having ties to a local street gang. The juvenile has been adjudicated delinquent for a property crime. When determining the appropriate disposition, what approach best balances the need for public safety with the rehabilitative goals of the Alabama juvenile justice system? Option A. Disregard the gang affiliation entirely, focusing solely on the property crime adjudicated, as association with a group does not directly prove individual culpability for the offense. Option B. Impose the maximum dispositional alternative available under Alabama law due to the inherent danger and criminal propensity associated with gang membership, regardless of the juvenile's specific actions in the current offense. Option C. Conduct a thorough assessment of the juvenile's specific role and level of involvement in the gang, considering this as one factor among many when developing a disposition that addresses their individual needs and risks, while also exploring rehabilitative programs that may help them disassociate from gang influence. Option D. Rely exclusively on the law enforcement intelligence report, identifying the juvenile as a gang member to justify a disposition that prioritizes incapacitation over rehabilitation, assuming the report accurately reflects the juvenile's current level of risk. The correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough assessment of the juvenile's specific role and level of involvement in the gang, considering this as one factor among many when developing a disposition that addresses their individual needs and risks, while also exploring rehabilitative programs that may help them disassociate from gang influence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the legal mandate to consider all relevant factors in sentencing with the ethical imperative to avoid prejudging a juvenile based on associations that may not directly reflect their culpability or rehabilitative potential. The Alabama Juvenile Justice Code emphasizes individualized assessment and rehabilitation. A juvenile's association with a gang, while potentially indicative of risk, cannot be the sole or primary determinant of disposition without careful consideration of the juvenile's specific role, level of involvement, and amenability to intervention. Over-reliance on gang affiliation can lead to disproportionate sanctions and undermine the rehabilitative goals of the juvenile justice system in Alabama. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment that considers gang involvement as one factor among many. This approach acknowledges the potential risks associated with gang affiliation, but insists on evaluating the juvenile's specific role, the nature and extent of their involvement, and their individual circumstances. It prioritizes gathering evidence of the juvenile's direct participation in criminal activity, their susceptibility to gang influence, and their willingness to disassociate from the gang. This aligns with Alabama's emphasis on individualized dispositions under Title 12, Chapter 15 of the Code of Alabama, which mandates consideration of the juvenile's background, needs, and the best interests of the state and the child. The focus remains on the juvenile's conduct and rehabilitative needs, rather than making assumptions based solely on association. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to automatically impose the most severe disposition available solely because the juvenile is identified as a gang member. This fails to adhere to the principle of individualized justice mandated by Alabama Juvenile Law. It presumes guilt or incorrigibility based on association, ignoring the requirement to assess the juvenile's specific actions and potential for rehabilitation. This approach risks violating the juvenile's due process rights by imposing a disposition not directly supported by their individual conduct. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss gang involvement entirely as irrelevant to the disposition. While the focus must be on the individual, gang affiliation can, in some circumstances, be a relevant factor in assessing risk and determining appropriate rehabilitative services or supervision needs. Ignoring this factor could lead to a disposition that is insufficient to address the underlying influences contributing to the juvenile's delinquent behavior, potentially failing to protect the community or promote the juvenile's long-term well-being. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on law enforcement intelligence reports regarding gang affiliation without independent verification or assessment of the juvenile's specific role. Such reports may be based on broad assumptions or outdated information. Alabama Juvenile Law requires a thorough and individualized assessment, not a rubber stamping of external classifications. This approach can lead to inaccurate conclusions about the juvenile's level of risk and needs, resulting in an inappropriate disposition. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach that begins with understanding the specific allegations against the juvenile. They must then gather comprehensive information about the juvenile's background, including family, school, and prior record. When gang involvement is alleged, it should be investigated thoroughly, focusing on the juvenile's specific actions, motivations, and level of commitment to the gang. This information should be weighed against the severity of the offense and the juvenile's demonstrated amenability to intervention. The ultimate disposition should be tailored to address the individual needs of the juvenile and the protection of the community, in accordance with the principles of the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code. Question 17. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a juvenile in Alabama has engaged in cyberbullying activities that have caused significant emotional distress to the victim and may have violated Alabama's cyberstalking laws. What is the most appropriate initial course of action for the school counselor who discovered this information? Option A. Confront the juvenile and their parents directly with the allegations and advise them to cease the behavior and delete all offending content. Option B. Advise the juvenile to apologize to the victim and consider the incident a minor misunderstanding that does not require further formal intervention. Option C. Recommend immediate suspension from school and referral to a private therapist without involving the juvenile justice system. Option D. Immediately notify the juvenile court intake officer and initiate a formal investigation in conjunction with law enforcement, ensuring all digital evidence is preserved according to forensic standards, and begin collaborating with a multidisciplinary team to assess the juvenile's needs for rehabilitation. Correct answer is D. Immediately notify the juvenile court intake officer and initiate a formal investigation in conjunction with law enforcement, ensuring all digital evidence is preserved according to forensic standards, and begin collaborating with a multidisciplinary team to assess the juvenile's needs for rehabilitation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves balancing the need for effective intervention with the rights and developmental needs of a juvenile offender. The rapid evolution of cybercrime presents unique investigative hurdles, and determining the appropriate course of action requires a nuanced understanding of Alabama's juvenile justice system, particularly concerning digital evidence and rehabilitation. The potential for significant harm caused by cybercrimes, coupled with the vulnerability of juvenile offenders, necessitates careful judgment to ensure both public safety and the best interests of the child. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment that prioritizes evidence preservation and adherence to Alabama's juvenile justice statutes. This approach mandates immediate notification of the appropriate juvenile court intake officer and the initiation of a formal investigation under the guidance of law enforcement. It requires careful documentation of all digital evidence in accordance with established forensic protocols to ensure its admissibility in court. Crucially, this approach emphasizes the need for a multidisciplinary team, including juvenile probation officers and potentially mental health professionals, to develop a rehabilitative plan that addresses the underlying causes of the juvenile's behavior, aligning with the rehabilitative philosophy of Alabama Juvenile Law. This aligns with the principles of the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act, which prioritizes intervention and rehabilitation while ensuring due process. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately confronting the juvenile and their parents with the alleged cybercrime without involving law enforcement or the juvenile court system. This bypasses critical legal procedures, potentially jeopardizing the integrity of evidence and violating the juvenile's rights to due process as outlined in Alabama law. It also fails to engage the structured rehabilitative framework provided by the juvenile justice system. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the incident as a minor prank and advise the juvenile to simply delete the offending content. This fails to acknowledge the potential severity of cybercrimes, which can have lasting legal and psychological consequences for victims and offenders alike. It also neglects the legal obligation to report and investigate potential violations of Alabama law, thereby undermining public safety and the rehabilitative goals of the juvenile justice system. A further incorrect approach is to focus solely on punitive measures without considering the rehabilitative needs of the juvenile. This might involve immediately recommending severe sanctions without a thorough assessment of the juvenile's background, motivations, or potential for reform. Such an approach neglects the core tenet of juvenile justice in Alabama, which is to provide guidance and opportunities for rehabilitation and reintegration into society. Professional reasoning. Professionals encountering such situations should first consult the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act and relevant case law to understand their legal obligations and the procedural requirements for handling juvenile offenders involved in cybercrime. They should then engage in a systematic process of evidence gathering and assessment, ensuring all actions are documented and legally sound. Collaboration with law enforcement, juvenile court personnel, and mental health professionals is essential to develop a holistic intervention strategy that addresses both the offense and the underlying issues contributing to the juvenile's behavior, always prioritizing the best interests of the child within the legal framework. Question 18. Quality control measures reveal that a 14-year-old student in Mobile County, Alabama, has accumulated 15 unexcused absences from school in the past month. The school counselor has attempted to contact the parents, but communication has been difficult due to the parents' work schedules. The social worker assigned to the case needs to determine the most appropriate next step in addressing this truancy. Which of the following represents the most effective and legally sound approach under Alabama juvenile law? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive assessment to understand the underlying reasons for the truancy. Engage the family in developing a plan that includes school-based interventions and community resources, and document all efforts before considering any formal legal action. Option B. Advise the parents that they are solely responsible for ensuring their child's attendance and that any further absences will result in legal consequences for them without offering any support services. Option C. Immediately file a truancy petition with the Mobile County Juvenile Court, citing the 15 unexcused absences as grounds for intervention. Option D. Classify the truancy as a minor issue that the school can manage internally and take no further action unless the absences significantly increase. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive assessment to understand the underlying reasons for the truancy. Engage the family in developing a plan that includes school-based interventions and community resources, and document all efforts before considering any formal legal action. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need to address a child's absence from school with the complex legal and ethical considerations surrounding juvenile status offenses in Alabama. A social worker must navigate the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act and related statutes, ensuring that interventions are appropriate, least restrictive, and in the best interest of the child, while also respecting parental rights and responsibilities. The risk of escalating a minor issue into a formal court proceeding without proper cause necessitates careful judgment. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive, multifaceted approach that prioritizes early intervention and support services before resorting to formal legal action. This includes conducting a thorough assessment of the underlying reasons for the truancy, engaging with the child and their family to understand the contributing factors, and exploring available community resources and school-based interventions. This approach aligns with the spirit of Alabama's juvenile laws, which aim to address the needs of children and families through supportive measures rather than solely punitive ones, emphasizing rehabilitation and prevention. The focus is on identifying and mitigating the root causes of truancy, such as family issues, learning disabilities, or mental health concerns, and connecting the family with appropriate services. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately filing a truancy petition with the juvenile court without first attempting to resolve the issue through less formal means. This fails to adhere to the principle of judicial economy and the legislative intent behind status offense statutes, which are designed to be a last resort. Such an action bypasses crucial steps of assessment and intervention, potentially subjecting the child and family to unnecessary legal scrutiny and stigma. Another incorrect approach is to solely blame the parents and expect them to resolve the truancy issues independently without offering any support or resources. While parents have a legal responsibility to ensure their child's attendance, Alabama law also recognizes the need for state and community support in addressing complex family challenges that may contribute to truancy. This approach neglects the collaborative nature of addressing juvenile issues and the availability of supportive services. A further incorrect approach is to dismiss the truancy as a minor issue and take no action, assuming the child will eventually return to school. This neglects the legal obligation to address truancy as a status offense and the potential negative long-term consequences for the child's education and future prospects. It also fails to uphold the protective mandate of juvenile law, which seeks to ensure the well-being and development of all children. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama dealing with juvenile status offenses should employ a tiered intervention model. This begins with informal assessment and engagement, followed by the exploration of school-based and community support services. Formal legal intervention should only be considered after all reasonable informal and supportive measures have been exhausted and documented, and when it is demonstrably in the best interest of the child and consistent with the Alabama Juvenile Justice Act. The decision-making process should be guided by a thorough understanding of the child's circumstances, family dynamics, and the available legal and social service frameworks within Alabama. Question 19. Quality control measures reveal a recurring pattern in Alabama juvenile court disposition hearings, where judges sometimes struggle to select the most appropriate sentencing options for delinquent youth. Considering the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code's emphasis on rehabilitation and the best interests of the child, which of the following approaches best reflects sound judicial decision-making during a disposition hearing? Option A. Prioritizing dispositional outcomes that are perceived as more punitive to satisfy public expectations, even if they are not the most effective for the child's long-term development. Option B. Conducting a thorough assessment of the child's individual needs, risks, and strengths, and then selecting dispositional alternatives that are tailored to address these factors, prioritizing rehabilitation and community reintegration where feasible. Option C. Ordering dispositional measures that are not readily available or supported by existing rehabilitative services within the state, assuming the child will somehow access them. Option D. Imposing a disposition that is primarily determined by the seriousness of the offense, with less emphasis on the child's personal circumstances or potential for rehabilitation. The correct answer is B. Conducting a thorough assessment of the child's individual needs, risks, and strengths, and then selecting dispositional alternatives that are tailored to address these factors, prioritizing rehabilitation and community reintegration where feasible. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because the juvenile court judge must balance the rehabilitative goals of Alabama juvenile law with the need for accountability and public safety. The judge must consider the specific circumstances of the offense, the child's developmental stage, their prior history, and the availability of appropriate services within the state. A disposition that is too lenient may fail to address the underlying issues contributing to the delinquency, while a disposition that is too severe may be counterproductive to rehabilitation and could lead to further negative outcomes for the child. The judge's decision has significant long-term implications for the child's future and the community. Correct approach analysis. The best approach involves a comprehensive assessment of the child's needs and risks, followed by the selection of dispositional alternatives that are tailored to address those specific factors, prioritizing rehabilitation and reintegration into the community where appropriate. This aligns with the fundamental principles of Alabama juvenile justice, which emphasize the best interests of the child and the state's parens patriae role. Alabama Code Section 12-15-201 outlines the court's broad authority to make dispositions that are in the best interest of the child and the public, including probation, counseling, community service, restitution, and placement in a residential facility. The judge must consider evidence presented regarding the child's background, mental health, educational status, and family support system to craft a disposition that is both effective and proportionate. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to impose a disposition solely based on the severity of the offense without a thorough consideration of the child's individual circumstances and rehabilitative potential. This fails to acknowledge the core philosophy of juvenile justice, which is distinct from adult criminal sentencing and focuses on intervention and correction rather than punishment alone. Such an approach risks imposing a sentence that is not conducive to the child's development or successful reintegration. Another incorrect approach would be to prioritize community pressure or public perception over the legal mandates and best interests of the child. While public safety is a consideration, the judge's primary duty is to apply the law fairly and to make dispositional decisions that are supported by evidence and aimed at the child's rehabilitation, as guided by Alabama juvenile statutes. A third incorrect approach would be to select a dispositional option that is not supported by available resources or services within Alabama. For example, ordering participation in a specific rehabilitative program that does not exist or is not accessible to the child would be an ineffective and potentially harmful disposition. The judge must ensure that the ordered disposition is practically implementable and aligned with the services available to the juvenile court system. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama juvenile court should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with a thorough review of all case information, including social histories, psychological evaluations, and any victim impact statements. They must then consult the relevant provisions of the Alabama Juvenile Justice Code, particularly those pertaining to dispositional hearings and sentencing options. The judge should actively consider the recommendations of probation officers and other professionals involved in the case. The ultimate decision should be a reasoned one, clearly articulated on the record, explaining how the chosen disposition serves the best interests of the child and the public, and how it aligns with the rehabilitative goals of the juvenile justice system. Question 20. Process analysis reveals that a juvenile in Alabama has been adjudicated dependent, and the court is considering appointing legal counsel for the parents. The parents are employed with a combined gross monthly income of $500. Their documented monthly expenses for essential living costs, housing, utilities, food, transportation, healthcare, total $4,200. They also have a $300 monthly payment for a pre-existing medical debt. Based on these figures, what is the most accurate calculation of the parent's discretionary income available for contributing to legal fees, and what is the most appropriate initial percentage of this discretionary income that the court might consider for a contribution order, adhering to Alabama Juvenile Justice Act principles? Option A. Discretionary income is $1, $300 per month, $5, $500 $4, $200. A reasonable initial contribution could be 25% of this discretionary income, totaling $325 per month. Option B. Discretionary income is $1, $000 per month, $5, $500 $4, $200 $300. A reasonable initial contribution could be 25% of this discretionary income, totaling $250 per month. Option C. Discretionary income is $1, $000 per month, $5, $500 $4, $200 $300. A reasonable initial contribution could be 50% of this discretionary income, totaling $500 per month. Option D. Discretionary income is $1, $300 per month, $5, $500 $4, $200. A reasonable initial contribution could be 10% of this discretionary income, totaling $130 per month. The correct answer is B. Discretionary income is $1, $000 per month, $5, $500 $4, $200 $300. A reasonable initial contribution could be 25% of this discretionary income, totaling $250 per month. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the need to accurately determine the financial capacity of a juvenile's parents to contribute to their legal defense. Miscalculating this capacity can lead to either an undue financial burden on the state or a denial of adequate legal representation for the juvenile, both of which have significant implications under Alabama Juvenile Law. The Alabama Juvenile Justice Act, AJA, mandates that the court consider the parent's ability to pay when appointing counsel. A precise calculation is crucial for upholding the juvenile's right to counsel and ensuring the efficient allocation of public resources. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough and systematic assessment of parental income, expenses, and assets to determine their ability to contribute to legal fees. This approach directly aligns with the principles of fairness and due process enshrined in the AJA. Specifically, Alabama law requires the court to consider the parent's financial resources when making a determination about their ability to pay for appointed counsel. A detailed calculation, such as the one presented in Option A, provides concrete data to support the court's decision, ensuring it is both legally sound and equitable. This method prioritizes the juvenile's right to effective legal representation while respecting the financial realities of the parents. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves making a generalized assumption about parental income based solely on their employment status, without a detailed financial review. This fails to account for variations in expenses, debts, or other financial obligations that might significantly impact their actual ability to contribute. Such an assumption could lead to an inaccurate assessment, potentially violating the AJA requirement for a thorough consideration of financial resources. Another incorrect approach is to solely rely on the parent's stated inability to pay without any independent verification or documentation. While parental testimony is important, it must be substantiated by financial information. Without this, the court cannot make an informed decision, and it risks misallocating state resources or denying a juvenile adequate representation if the parents are, in fact, able to contribute. A third incorrect approach is to apply a fixed percentage of gross income without considering essential living expenses. Alabama law, as reflected in the AJA, implies a holistic view of financial capacity, not a rigid formula that ignores the practicalities of maintaining a household. This approach could unfairly burden parents who, despite a seemingly adequate gross income, have high unavoidable expenses, thus compromising the spirit of equitable contribution. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama juvenile court must adopt a data-driven and legally compliant approach to assessing parental financial capacity. This involves a systematic collection and analysis of financial information, including income statements, tax returns, and expense ledgers, to accurately gauge the parent's ability to contribute to legal fees. The decision-making framework should prioritize the juvenile's right to counsel as guaranteed by the AJA, ensuring that financial limitations do not impede effective legal representation. Simultaneously, it must ensure that any contribution ordered is reasonable and proportionate to the parent's actual financial resources, preventing undue hardship.